But it's good to be back with you here, and got a brand new series that we're going to start this morning. I hope that you will be encouraged by it and challenged by it, as I have been so far. It's been interesting lately watching God just sort of moving in my own life. There's been times in my ministry where I've been able to see very clearly what He's doing in the church that I shepherded, in the lives of the people that I knew, but not always aware of what He's doing in my life. And now it seems that He has really flipped the whole script for me. And I oftentimes, to be honest, I have no idea what He's doing in this church. Especially now, because we're just so disjointed from one another. We're afraid to get any closer than 6 feet closer to each other. So it's hard to kind of know what's going on in other people's lives when they got a mask over their face and they're, afraid to even get near you. And I don't always know what's going on in the lives of people that are around me. You would think that you would get a little bit more intuitive as you got closer and older, but I just seem to get less. But one of the things that I am very, very aware of is what God is doing in my life. And it just has been such a blessing. I wish I was better equipped to explain it to you. And one of the ways that He has been revolutionizing my life has just been my time in His Word. And it just seems to come alive to me. And I'm so excited about that because it's a joy. It's a joy to come into His presence. And I feel like it is changing me, even though sometimes the change doesn't come as fast as I would like, and I'm certain that it doesn't come as fast as other people would like. But it is coming, I feel like. And to that end, that's what we're going to talk about in our new series. Our new series is titled Salvage, Rescued for a Reason. I asked a question during my promo video. Do you know why God saved you, if you're saved? Do you know why He picked you? God doesn't do anything willy-nilly. He has a reason for everything He does, which means that if He chose you to save you, He had a reason for it. And my question was, do you know what it is? And I find most believers probably don't have any idea why God saved them. And yet that is so important. The Bible says that God saves every person that He saves because He has a reason. He wants them to do something very specific. And if we don't know what it is, how can we do it? How can we know if we are doing it? And if we can't know that we're doing it, or if we aren't doing it because we don't know what it is, how does God feel about that? Probably not real good. Which means we need to figure out what we're here for. And the good news is that God tells us in His Word why He saves us. And today we're going to talk about the first reason. And as soon as I tell you, most of you are going to shut me off. You're just gonna. Many of you may have shut me off already. I may be talking to a blank wall already. But I'm going to tell you what the first one is. God saved you to be a leader. Now, a lot of you right now are thinking, oh boy, he picked the wrong guy. He picked the wrong gal. I am not a leader. I'm not anything close to a leader. I never have been a leader. I never will be a leader. I've tried to lead. I've failed miserably. I know leaders. I could point out leaders for you if you're really looking for leaders. But if He wanted a leader, boy, did He come to the wrong person. If that's how you feel, you're exactly in the right place. Today's message is for you. Maybe I should have called it unleadership. Because the person that we're going to discuss today didn't think he was a leader, didn't think he ever could be a leader. He knew leaders. He would point them out for you, but he wasn't one. And I'm convinced to the day he died, he didn't think he was a leader. And yet, if you ask most people, was this person a leader? They would tell you straight away, absolutely he was a leader. So how can we be so convinced that we're not able to be a leader and yet still lead? And what does that all mean by way of what God wants us to do? Well, today we're going to take a look at that in our first installment of the reason why God rescued us. And so the person we're going to talk about is Moses. Turn, if you will, in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus 3. And as you're doing that, I'm going to pray. And then what else? I'm going to give you some history. Father, we thank you this morning that you had a purpose in saving us. It isn't just to hunker down and try to avoid COVID-19. It isn't, Lord, to just go about our daily lives. You have something very specific that you want us to do. And we're here to do it, and we're the only ones who can do it. You don't have a plan B. And one of those things is leadership, Lord, and that scares us because we don't think that we can lead or that we should lead or that we are leaders. Thank you for the example we're going to take a look at today. He felt the exact same way because he didn't understand what your kind of leadership is. So teach us this morning. Speak to us, Lord. We promise we'll listen. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Exodus 3. Before we get to Exodus 3, I have to give you some history. Now, you're in really good shape today because last week I had to give you some history, and it was 16 chapters we had to go through. We don't have to go through anywhere near 16 chapters today. We have a very manageable 7 chapters to go through, okay? And we're going to pick it up at where we left the story off last time, with the story of Joseph. If you remember, at the end of Joseph's story, he is reconciled with his brothers, and he has sent an invitation through them to his father Jacob to relocate into Egypt because there's a famine in the area. And if Jacob doesn't come, he and his family are going to starve. So he sends the invitation with his brothers. His brothers go home, and they speak to their father and convince him to move to Egypt. So Jacob relocates to Egypt from Hebron, which is where he was living at the time. It's about 19 miles south of Jerusalem. It is where his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham had lived. It was a little piece of land that they had staked out in the middle of an area called Canaan. And he picks up his whole family and he moves to Goshen to live there, to be reunited with his son Joseph, and to be cared for by him and the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so all of the Israelites move to Goshen. And while they're under the care of Joseph, they flourish. They have plenty of food because Joseph is in charge of all the storehouses of Egypt. So they have plenty of food. And they're in a rich land, the best land in Egypt, that's located right by the delta of the Nile. So it's very well irrigated, got plenty of rainfall. To this day, the area of Goshen in Egypt is one of the best pieces of property in the whole nation. So they were there in a place where their herds would flourish, where their crops could flourish once the famine was over. And they were doing real well. So much so it says that they were flourishing and prospering, and they were buying up property. They were becoming wealthy because, hey, their guy, their representative, is the vizier of Egypt, Joseph. And they're doing real well. And they begin to multiply in number. There's more and more of them. On the other hand, the Egyptians weren't doing so well, because most of the Egyptians were like everybody else in the world. They hadn't really understood that there was going to be a famine, so they hadn't really prepared for it. And when it hit, like most things like that, it wiped them out. All the money that they had saved, they had to spend it to buy grain. And then they ran out of grain. So they had to take all the livestock they had and sell them to get grain. Then they had to take all their possessions in the world and sell them to get grain. And when they ran out of that, they sold their homes and all their property to get grain. And when they ran out of that, they sold the last thing they had left in the world, which was themselves. And they literally went to the Pharaoh through his vizier, and they said, "We need grain, we're desperate, we've sold you everything we have, we're starving, we're selling ourselves to you." And Joseph accepted their terms and said, "Okay, from now on you will all, the entire nation, become bondservants to my master the Pharaoh." And he turned them into essentially sharecroppers. He told them, "I'm going to send you back to your land. If you had livestock, I'm going to let you take care of," it's not your livestock anymore, but Pharaoh's livestock. "If you had crops that could grow, I'm going to let you take care of those crops. They're not your crops anymore. They're Pharaoh's crops. Everything you have, I'm going to let you manage, but you're going to now take care of it for Pharaoh. And here's the deal. Of everything you produce, you can keep 4/5 of it to live on. But you have to give 1/5 of it, 20% of everything you have, to Pharaoh, because you're on his land doing his work with his stuff." So the people don't have any land, they don't have any livestock, they don't have any money, they don't have any possessions, they don't even own themselves. They now work for Pharaoh, and they only get to keep a percentage of what they work for. So you can imagine they weren't real happy. And so you have this real stark difference between all of the Israelites that were living in Goshen. Well, they're fat on food because they get all their food for free, because the guy in charge of the food is one of them. And they've got so much money coming in from the fact they don't got to worry about food, that they can sell their livestock, and they're buying up land cheap from the Egyptians, who are selling it to anybody they can in order to get money for grain, or maybe even swapping it straight across to the Israelites for grain, who get it for free. They're selling all their possessions, much of it to the Israelites. And the Egyptians are starting to look at the Israelites and ask themselves a question. How come these foreigners get to come and live in the best part of our country, and they get to live here for free, and they get their food for free, and we're starving, and we got to sell everything we got just to get by, just because they have a person who's well connected to our king? What's up with that? And so there's a sort of a growing resentment against the Israelites, but it doesn't really get voiced because they're too afraid of Joseph and they're too afraid of the Pharaoh. So the Israelites are doing real good, and the Egyptians not so much. Well, this goes on for a while longer, and then the Pharaoh dies, Jacob dies, Joseph dies. All of the characters that were a part of our story last week, they die. And time passes, and a new Pharaoh comes to power. And then another Pharaoh after him. And eventually a Pharaoh comes to power who's a man of the people, and who had the same opinion that the people had. First of all, he didn't know who Joseph was. He didn't care who Joseph was. He didn't care about the previous pharaohs and what decisions they had made. He cared about his people, and he cared about himself. And he looked at his people and he said, "My people are essentially bondservants to the throne. And these Israelites, who aren't even Egyptians, who live in their own separate land and have their own separate language and dress their own way and have their own language and have all their weird rules and their own God that they serve, and they're not really a part of us, but they're taking the best that we have, and it isn't fair." And so he makes a decision that is an eerie precursor to what happened in the late 1930s in Germany. A new king rises to power, in this case the Chancellor of Germany, and he sees the Jews in his country, who were the bankers and the business owners and very prosperous, and he decided they were to blame for all of Germany's problems. No, they weren't. Germany was to blame for all of Germany's problems. But he blamed them because he knew that it would be a good way to be catapulted to power. He scapegoated them, and then he changed everything. Well, that's what this new Pharaoh does. He institutes martial law in Goshen, which means now you people are no longer independently governed, and you people are no longer free to do what you want. We tell you what to do. And he reclassified every single person living there as a slave. He was a very popular Pharaoh with the Egyptians because he set those people free and instituted all kinds of social reforms where they were able to get their property back and not have to work so much for the crown. And he blamed all of their trouble on the Israelites living in Goshen, and he turned them into their slaves. He turned them into their workforce. He sent them to labor camps. And things changed suddenly for the Israelites. Now they can't own any property. Their property is confiscated. They can't own any possessions. Their possessions are confiscated. They can't have any money. Their money is confiscated. They're not free to choose how they're going to live or what they're going to do. They get their livestock taken, and ultimately they become the workforce of all of Egypt. And they are given the worst of the worst jobs. They have to take on the construction job of building the pyramids and building the big cities of Egypt, which was dangerous work. And they were viewed as expendable commodities, no different really other maybe than a donkey, although a donkey would have been more highly valued. One of them dies, sweep them out of the way, bring in another one. The Israelites went from being affluent to being starved, being brutalized, and having to work to stay alive. Very similar to what happened in Nazi Germany. And because of that, they begin to cry out to God because they're miserable. Well, meanwhile, the Pharaoh has another worry about these people. Even though they're mistreated, they continue to grow in number. They're just having babies left and right. Even though now they're slaves and they don't have any of their own property and they're barely getting by, barely getting enough food to eat, and they're doing all the dirty work. They're either building the cities or they got turned into field workers. Once the famine ended, they were harvesting the crops and doing all the low-end dirty work that field workers have to do. But despite all of that, they kept multiplying and multiplying and multiplying in number. And they were getting bigger in number than the people living in Egypt. And the Pharaoh got concerned about that. He thought to himself, hey, listen, what if war breaks out? What if another nation comes and attacks us? And when they attack us, they go to the Israelites and they say to them, hey, join us against the Egyptians and we'll set you free. And the Pharaoh, as he thought about that, began to really fear these Israelites because he thought to himself, why wouldn't they join an enemy against us? We treat them horribly. We've made them our slaves. And so he decides this threat has to be dealt with. So he institutes a birth control policy that's very similar to postpartum abortion. He goes to the midwives who were helping the Jewish women to have all these children, and he says to them, listen, here's what I want you to do. From now on, whenever a Jewish woman is about to give birth, the first thing you're to do is to check to see if it's a boy or a girl. If it's a girl, fine. If it's a boy, kill it on the spot. They've been actually doing the reverse of that in China for years. So the midwives have a problem because they fear God. They fear Israel's God. As a matter of fact, these were probably Jewish women. So they know on one hand the Pharaoh is demanding of them that they have to execute these male Hebrew children, but at the same time they know that that would be a horrifying sin against God, and they're unwilling to do it. So they refuse to kill the male babies. And when Pharaoh calls them to account for it, they just simply say, hey, listen, You know what these Hebrew women are like? One minute they're out picking grapes, the next minute they drop a kid down, and the next minute after that they're picking grapes again. You can't stop them. They're just too hardy. Nothing like a nice racial stereotype to get you out of trouble. So all of a sudden Pharaoh gets mad because I think he suspects what they're doing, but he can't prove it. And he's thwarted temporarily. But then Pharaoh comes up with another idea. And he says, you know what? If I can't get these Hebrew midwives to do what I want, I bet I can get the Egyptian people to do it. So he makes a general announcement to the population of Egypt, and he puts a bounty on every male Hebrew child's head. And he tells his people, if you see a Hebrew woman having a male Hebrew baby, it's your patriotic duty, and you will be rewarded if you execute that child. And with that, the slaughter is on. Egyptians are keeping an eye on Hebrews. They're watching to see if they see any pregnant Hebrew women. And then as soon as they do, they identify them and they make sure that they spy on them. And if that woman has a male child, they make sure that child gets killed. So now the Hebrews are crying out even more, because not only are they enslaved and impoverished and starved, but now their children are being slaughtered. During all of that, a Hebrew woman who was from the tribe of Levi, she gets pregnant. And when she gets pregnant, I'm sure she did what all the women then were doing. They were probably trying to hide their pregnancy as best they could. And she manages to succeed in doing that. And she gives birth to a baby, and she sees it's a little boy. A beautiful, precious little boy. And now her heart panics because she knows that her little boy is being hunted. So she hides him very cleverly. She hides him for 3 months. Imagine how hard that must have been to keep a baby hidden when every ear around you is listening for his cry. But she does it for 3 months, and unfortunately, she eventually gets to the place where she realizes that the discovery of her child is both inevitable and imminent. She can't keep him hidden any longer. And she slips into despair because she doesn't know what to do. And finally, in an act of desperation, she takes a papyrus basket and she uses sealant on it to make it watertight. And she puts a little blanket in there and she places her son in the papyrus basket and she takes it down to the Nile River. And she puts it into the water right next to the shore where all the reeds grew up and would sort of provide cover for the child. She says her goodbye. She whispers a desperate prayer. And then she leaves because she can't stand to stay to see what's going to happen. I'm sure in her mind she thought, an Egyptian's going to come along, they're going to see my son, and they're going to put him to the sword right then and there. But she has to know what happened. So she stations her daughter to watch from a distance to see what happens to the basket. The daughter stays there. We find out later on that her name was Miriam. And she watches the basket to see what God will do. In an enormous irony, at that same time, the daughter of Pharaoh, the guy who has issued the execution order, happens to be coming down to the Nile River along with her attendants in order to bathe. And she gets to the water, and as she approaches the reeds, she hears something. And then she moves closer, and she sees a basket. And she looks in the basket, and she sees a little boy, a beautiful, precious little boy. And she can tell by looking at him right away that he's a Hebrew boy. He's not Egyptian. And she knows her father's edict. She's a princess of Egypt. And she knows that this little boy is doomed to die if he's discovered. And yet the more she looks at him, the more her heart swells. And she begins to realize, I can't let this happen. It doesn't matter that this little baby is a different race from mine. It doesn't matter that this little baby belongs to a people that all my people hate, that I've been taught my entire life to hate. This is a precious little baby. And if I don't save him, nobody will. And I can't bear the thought of this baby being killed. So she swears her attendance to secrecy. She picks the child up and she says, I'm going to raise this child as my own. And if anybody asks, including my father, I'll tell him, it's my baby. He doesn't pay that much attention to me anyway. How's he going to know? So she does that. And meanwhile, hiding off a distance is Miriam, who sees what happens and can't believe it. She overhears the conversation and she's delighted. So she runs up to Pharaoh's daughter and she says, hey, this little boy's going to need somebody to nurse him. Would you like me to go find one of the Hebrew women to nurse this boy for you? And Pharaoh's daughter says, brilliant. Absolutely. Yes. So Miriam says, well, I'll tell you what. I'll take the little boy and I'll take you and I'll lead you to where this woman is. And she takes her to her mother, never letting on what their relationship is. And then Pharaoh's daughter asks Miriam's mother, would you be willing to nurse this little baby for me that I found? And of course, the mother says, absolutely. So she receives back her own son and now will be paid to do what she longed to do anyway, to nurse and care for him. So she takes care of her child, and meanwhile, Pharaoh's daughter decides, I have to give this little boy a name. And she has to make him look as Egyptian as possible because now he has to pass for her son. If anybody asks this Hebrew woman why she's taking care of this little boy, this Hebrew woman has to be able to say, this is an Egyptian boy. Can't you tell by the way he's dressed? Matter of fact, this is the child of Pharaoh's daughter. I'm just the nurse here. I'm the au pair. I'm taking care of him. So she gives the baby an Egyptian name, Moses. And the reason she names him that is because it's sort of a play on words. The word Moses in Egyptian means to be born of something. There were pharaohs who had Moses in their name, Tutmos III. And so she took that name for this little boy. He's born of the water because his life began when I pulled him out of the Nile. And so Moses is weaned by his mother until he's finally old enough and then presented back before a lot of questions get asked to the princess who raises him as her own son. So here, even among the Pharaoh's own court, in his own palace, his own daughter has brought one of the Hebrew children that he wanted to execute. Moses grows up in the royal court. He looks like an Egyptian, dresses like an Egyptian, speaks Egyptian, very similar to what happened with Joseph. Only Moses had been taught from the time he was very, very young. However, just as his mother knew that he was a Hebrew child, he too knew that he was a Hebrew child, probably because his mother taught him that and then taught him, you have to keep this quiet. So Moses was always aware of the fact that he was sort of an outsider, that he was pretending to be an Egyptian, but in fact was a Hebrew. He grew up with all of the blessings and all of the privilege of the royal court, but he never lost his cultural connection to his own people. And he knew his people were being enslaved by his step-grandfather and his people. Well, one day, when Moses was about 40, he decided that he had to go off into Goshen and to connect with his people. So he goes and he's there, and as he's watching, he sees how badly his people are being mistreated. Visualize some of the old imagery that you could have seen from World War II with the death camps that the Jews were in. And they were ostensibly Germany's workforce. They made the Jews do all the dirty work. And then they executed those that they didn't want. Well, that's what Moses sees when he looks out over Egypt in Goshen. He sees his people doing some of the dirtiest, hardest, most dangerous work possible. They work from sun up to sundown. They're paid nothing. They're mistreated. They can be killed by an Egyptian, beaten by an Egyptian. There are no rules because they're slaves. One day while Moses is out watching all of this, and it's breaking his heart, and he's trying to think, what can I do about this? Something needs to be done. This isn't right. These are my people. And he sees an Egyptian ruthlessly beating a helpless Hebrew. I mean, just beating him to a pulp. Probably was planning to beat him to death. And something in Moses just snaps. And he decides, no, I can't let this happen. So he looks around to make sure nobody's watching. And then he goes and he confronts the Egyptian man. And they get into a conflict and he kills him. Probably just from sheer rage. And then he realizes what he's done. So he drags the guy's body off and he buries him out in the sand. He thinks that's the end of it. He hopes that's the end of it. But then the next day he goes out back to the same place and he sees two Hebrews fighting with one another. And the guy that instigated it, the real troublemaker, when Moses tells him, hey, why are you guys fighting? You're brothers. You want to fight somebody? Fight the Egyptians. Don't fight each other. You're to blame. Stop this. And the guy that's to blame looks up to him and says, who are you to tell me what to do? You can't tell me what to do. You have no authority here. Unless, of course, you're planning on doing to me what you did to that Egyptian yesterday. And Moses realizes that his secret is out. And he's right. He becomes very afraid, and rightly so, because as soon as Pharaoh finds out about it, he decides to execute Moses. And so Moses has to get out of town, and he has to get out of town fast. So he takes off out of Egypt, and he heads east. Eventually, he crosses the desert, the Negev, it's called. Today it would be called the Sinai Peninsula, the southern part of Israel. And he gets across the Red Sea, or goes around it, and eventually comes to a new land called Midian. Midian would be Saudi Arabia today. And when he gets there, he encounters a man who had a bunch of daughters. The guy's name was Reuel. And this Reuel, he has 7 daughters. Moses probably thought, I'm 40, unmarried, former prince of Egypt. I've arrived in the promised land. 7 daughters, and they're all shepherdesses. That's a hard word to say. Shepherdesses. They take care of Reuel's, their father's, sheep for him. And when Moses arrives there, he finds them at the family watering hole, but they're having a problem. There are some male shepherds there with different flocks, and basically they're trying to take the watering hole away from these girls. And they're doing it by physical force. Moses shows up and says, I don't think so. And he gets these guys to take off, and then he waters all the sheep of these 7 girls. I'm sure all the time they were oohing and awing. And then they take him back to their father, Reuel. They introduce him. And Reuel offers hospitality. He brings Moses in, he feeds him, he keeps him for a time, and then eventually invites him to stay. And so Moses stays and becomes a shepherd for Reuel. And as time passes, he's not just an employee, but eventually becomes a member of the family because he marries one of Reuel's daughters, whose name was Zipporah. Now Moses lives in the area of Midian. The Midianites were nomads, which meant they traveled from place to place. They spent a lot of their time around the Red Sea, but they also traveled across the Red Sea and into the Negev wilderness and in that area of the Sinai Peninsula today in order to take care of their sheep. So they sort of moved around a lot. Moses will spend the next 40 years working for his father-in-law, who was also called Jethro, for those of you who are wondering. He had a couple of names. And he winds up taking care of his sheep. He's married to his daughter. He starts having kids, and he's happy as a clam. He's happy as a clam. He's living among the Midianites. He's married to a Midianite woman. He's got Hebrew/Midianite children. He's got a nice job. He's well cared for. He's in a quiet land where he doesn't have any stress. He's out of Pharaoh's reach. He doesn't have to deal with his people anymore, the Hebrews, because they've disappointed him. And he's happy. 40 years he spends roving the Negev. Meanwhile, God's people, the Israelites, are suffering, and they are crying out to their God. And Pharaoh, his former step-grandfather, dies. A new Pharaoh comes to power, and he's much, much worse. He's merciless. And so he really begins to make life for the Israelites horrific. Their male children are still being slaughtered. They have nothing. They're treated as slaves. They're treated ruthlessly. And so they are crying out to God. Crying out to God. And God hears and decides it's time to do something about it. And with that, we pick up the story. Exodus 3. Moses is about 80 years old. He's working for Reuel as sort of his master shepherd. He's married to one of his daughters. And he's traveling about in the Negev desert in the southern part of Israel, modern Israel. He's just a shepherd. But God decides that his people need to be rescued and that he's going to use a person to do it. As God most commonly does use people for his work. And he decides the person he's going to use is this shepherd. So, verse 1 of Exodus 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, the name Horeb, I think it got that name later on, after this story went on. At the time, I think it was probably just a nondescript area in the Negev. But it's interesting. It says that Moses was tending Jethro's flock. What an interesting training regimen for somebody who's about to become perhaps one of the greatest spiritual leaders that Israel has ever known. The name of Moses today in Israel is still revered. Children still name their sons Moshe, Moses. And yet, he's a shepherd, and he doesn't see himself as a leader. He doesn't want to be a leader. He's not looking to be a leader. He's not trained to be a leader. He is a shepherd. And yet God, in looking for a leader, picks a shepherd. I can see why. You think about it. All this time, 40 years, Moses has been becoming familiar with very unfriendly terrain, leading a bunch of sheep, which aren't the smartest animals in the world, safely through that terrain, keeping them safe from attacking animals and thieves, keeping them fed and watered. And God wants him to lead his sheep out of Egypt. So he picks a shepherd. And what's interesting too is that the 40 years that Moses has just spent traveling this area is the same amount of time that the Israelites are going to wind up spending once they leave Egypt and head toward the mountain of God. In Hebrew, the name Horeb means desert or desolation. Not a very inviting thought, is it? Let's go to the mountain of desolation. But it was a descriptive term for the area. The wilderness of the Negev is a very unfriendly place, and I'll describe it more for you in a little bit here. And it's likely that this place, later on, it would become known as Mount Sinai, and that's why it's called the Sinai Peninsula today, because somewhere in that little triangle shape of land, they know that this great mountain exists. We just don't know where it is today. We have no idea where Mount Sinai is. It's very likely that Mount Sinai represented the specific peak that Moses met with God at, both here, later on when he gets the Ten Commandments, and that Horeb described the mountain range in which this peak rested. But we don't know where it was. But apparently it was known to the ancients, because if you take a look at the story of Elijah, you see when he starts running from Jezebel to get away from her, you know where he goes? All the way down south, past through the Negev, and to Mount Horeb. So during Elijah's time, they still knew where the mountain was. It's just been lost to us today, but not for lack of people searching for it. Verse 2, it says, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up." Angel of the Lord, that term, the word angel means messenger. So as Moses is traveling through this secluded area, he sees something. He sees a bush on fire. And we're told that the angel of the Lord was going to appear there in the flames of the fire from within this bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. A burning bush. What was this burning bush all about? I think we put a lot of emphasis on the burning bush. Did you know that there's a group of people in southern Israel today that actually believe they have found the burning bush? If you want to go to Israel and visit, quote unquote, what they claim is the burning bush, which I am very skeptical of, but if you want to visit it, they have a place that they say this is where the burning bush was. Why did God use a burning bush here? You want to know why? Real practical. He needed to get Moses' attention. Moses is traipsing through the wilderness, a place he's been through many, many times. When you're out in the desert and you're out in the wilderness, you see some weird stuff. So God decides to give him a sight that would be so unique, it would stop him and force him to investigate. So he chooses a burning bush. Now the funny thing is, a burning bush in the middle of the wilderness wasn't very uncommon. Did you know that temperatures in this area reach 129 degrees? You think it's hot outside today? 129 degrees. Bushes spontaneously ignite in that kind of weather all the time. Moses, I'm sure, was constantly walking through and seeing different things on fire. But what wasn't common was for when one of these things caught fire, for it not to be burned up. It's interesting, the word bush in Hebrew literally means bramble, a thorn bush, a big thorn bush. And those are common, almost like sagebrush out in the desert. And he comes across this huge bramble, and it's ablaze with fire, but nothing's being burned up. So it stops him. Verse 5, so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. So you see, God, it worked. All God wanted was to get Moses' attention. The bush worked. So he goes over to take a look at it, and when he got close, God called to him, verse 4, from within the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. God called to Moses from within this bush. Moses sees a miracle in this bush. He goes to investigate, and when he gets there, God calls to him. That tells you something. It tells you that, first of all, God will do the miraculous. He'll do it in your life, and when he does, there's a reason for it. When God does a miracle in your life, it's because he's revealing himself and or his plan to you. If you can think back on something that God has done that was very special for you, you can know that the reason he did it was to reveal himself and his plan to you. He calls him by his name twice. He says, Moses, Moses. When God does call to you and reveal his plan, it's always personal. Notice that God doesn't say from the burning bush, hey, you. Psst. Notice he calls him by name. God always does that when he wants to use somebody. It's personal. It's specific. And then lastly, when he says to Moses, hey, Moses responds, here I am. When God calls us, it's always expectational. He's calling us because he wants a response. You know what drives me crazy? When I call out to my kids and they don't answer me. You parents, can I get an amen? When you call out to your parents, you call it to your kids, you call them by name, there's no ambiguity, and they don't answer you. When God calls our name, when he gets our attention, he wants us to answer. It's important. Verse 5, don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Don't come any closer. Isn't that interesting? First, he invites Moses to come close, but before he gets too close, he stops him. He stops him. And why? Because Moses didn't really know who God was yet. God's revealing himself to him. And Moses needed to understand who God was. And one of the things he needed to understand is that when we come to God, there needs to be a certain attitude. Reverence, respect, and recognition of the fact that we're sinful and he's holy. We serve a holy God, and though he loves us and he calls us personally and he wants us to come close, we have to understand we just can't come up and put our arms around the burning bush and say, hey God, it's good to have you. You're my bro. We're going to be like this. No, wait a minute. Don't come any closer, he tells him. And then he tells him, take off your shoes because you're on holy ground. Holy ground. I thought about that. Why is this holy ground? Is it because the place was so special? It's just dirt. It's just a dirty old mountain. Sheep have been grazing over it many, many times. Nothing particularly or intrinsically holy about this place. What made it holy was because God's presence was there. God's presence was there, and that made it holy. I thought about that. You know, people today take vacations looking for what are called venerated spots. A venerated spot is a spot that is supposed to be holy because something really important that God did happened there. And so people travel, they save up their money, they get on an airplane or a boat, and they go halfway across the world to go to a venerated site. People do it all the time. They go to Jerusalem, the great city of God. They go to Bethlehem. They go to the Jordan River. They want to be baptized. They go to the Sea of Galilee, and they want to be where Jesus walked and did ministry. They go to Gethsemane. They want to be where Jesus was praying. They go to Golgotha. They want to be where Jesus was crucified. People travel the Holy Land all the time, going from venerated site to venerated site. And half the time, we're not even really sure that that was the venerated site. Maybe you can go visit Jesus' grave. I really doubt that they have found the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea after all these years. And yet people go visit these places all the time. And you know why? because they're looking for something magical. They're looking for a taste of the divine. They're just sure if they can put their foot in the same river where Joshua crossed and the water split in two, that something magical will happen. If they can walk through the holy city where Jesus taught, something amazing will happen. People are always looking for venerated, quote-unquote, holy sites, and they go there with expectations and with joy. And when they come back, and do you see this little vial of water? This was drawn from the Jordan River. We're always looking for holy ground. You want to know something really fascinating? If you go visit any of these places, and I'm not bad-mouthing doing that, but what I'm saying is, if you go visit any of these places, the chances that you're actually going to be most of the time where something really big happened is very unlikely, if for no other reason than the fact that cities have been built on top of cities. And things change over time. But here's the more important point, okay? If you're really looking for holy ground, what makes holy ground is the presence of God. That's what makes it holy. And what breaks my heart is that Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, people neglect and give no mind to coming to a place where God is there every week. The Bible says, where two or more are gathered, I am there in your very midst. Did you know that in Ephesians 5:27, it says that the church is both holy and radiant? If you're looking for holy ground, you found it. You're on it. This is holy ground. Not because of the location. It's no better than the dirt of wherever Mount Horeb was. It's because God is here. God is here amongst His people. That is, we're celebrating. This is holy ground. Breaks my heart. People travel halfway across the world looking for holy ground. There's holy ground just right down the street and they can't be bothered. End of the sermonette, onto the sermon. Verse 6. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. First of all, God identifies himself to Moses by saying, I'm your father's God. Isn't that interesting? Moses probably didn't really know his father all that well. Now, I'm sure he may have been aware of who his real mom was. Maybe his sister would have told him. Maybe he just figured it out on his own. Kids that are sort of adopted always tend to eventually try to figure out who their parents are, and they're very industrious. So maybe he had an identification of who his father was, but he certainly didn't know him very well because he wasn't raised by him. He was raised in Pharaoh's court. So God says, let me tell you a little bit about your father, your real father. I'm his father. I'm his God. I'm also, by the way, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 3 of your heroes, 3 of the pillars of the faith. Which tells you that faith is in many ways a legacy. If you're a father and you have children or grandchildren, it is your responsibility to translate your faith to them. Can your grandkids say, you know, my God is my father's God. It's my mother's God. It's my grandmother's God. My grandfather's God. Faith is a legacy. And then he says that as soon as he identified himself, Moses hid his face. Why? Why does he hide his face? Well, because Moses knew. He had enough understanding about who God was to know that to see God's face is to die because he's holy. So even though he walks up on this burning bush and it's not consumed and that's weird and he doesn't understand it, and then he hears a voice come from it and it calls him by name, and then he says, here I am. And then when the voice finally identifies himself and says, I'm God, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of a sudden Moses is thunderstruck by who he's talking to, and he tries to hide because he realizes, holy God, sinful man, not a good combination. I'll be destroyed. Matter of fact, Moses would write that later on in Exodus 33:20. No man can see God and live. Moses understood. He had reverence. Verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. Isn't that interesting? He says, I've heard. Do you ever feel like God isn't listening? You ever feel like, man, I'm miserable, and I keep telling God about it, and it doesn't feel like there's anybody home. There's somebody home. He hears. He's listening. Verse 8. God says, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Notice that God says, I've come down to save them. I've come down. You know, when God needs to save us, he comes down to save us. When Jesus was born, it says they gave him the name Emmanuel. You know what that meant? God with us. He came down to rescue. He's willing to come down and associate with the likes of us to save us because he loves us. And here he's telling Moses, I've come down to save my people. Notice that he also says, I've come to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land. So in other words, I've come to save my people from the slavery they're in and to save them to a new land. A land, by the way, where they had actually come from and had chosen to stay in Goshen all these years, 430 in all, because the good life was there, even though it wasn't their home and wasn't where they're supposed to be. By all rights, they should have come home after the famine, but they didn't, and it cost them. So now God is allowing the consequences of their sin to drive them to call out to him so that he can save them and take them home where they belong, and not just take them home to where they were, but to give them the whole thing, to deliver unto them the promise that he had made years before to Jacob, to Isaac, and to Abraham. God always saves us from something, and he saves us to something. That's my question. If you were saved from something, do you know what you were saved to? In this case, Moses is told, you're going to go and be the instrument for me to rescue my people. Verse 9, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Once again, he says, their cry has reached me. Their prayers, I've listened, I've heard them. Our prayers have the power to reach up to God and to move him. Verse 10, so now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I'm sending you. Interesting that God uses us. Every day that I wake up and I realize this is my job, I always shake my head like, boy, God, I know I don't question your will, but it just feels like you picked the wrong guy. You picked the wrong guy because I'm just not equipped. I relate to Moses a lot. I don't feel like I'm a leader. And yet God says, I'm sending you. Verse 11, now come the objections. Whenever God tells us he wants us to do something, the first thing we start thinking of is why we can't or shouldn't do it. Isn't it funny that we don't just say, okay, if that's what I'm supposed to do, peace out, I'm on my way. We don't do that. God tells us to do that, and we start stuttering and stammering and coming up with excuses. And what kind of excuses do we come up with? The same two excuses that this guy used. Excuse number one, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? First thing is we start looking at all of our either A, flaws and inadequacies, or B, resources / lack thereof. And we put it all on us. We think either I'm not worthy to go do what you're telling me to do, God, or I'm not equipped to do what you're telling me to do, but I can't do it. I don't have the strength to do it. I don't have the character or the giftedness, or I'm not, I don't have charisma. I'm not a natural born leader. I'm just an everyday Joe. I'm just a shepherd. You got the wrong guy. Later on, he's going to throw his brother Aaron under the bus and say, you really want a guy who can talk and lead? Have you met my brother Aaron? Now that's the guy you should talk to, just like we always do. Well, I really can't lead that thing, but I'll tell you, I know somebody who can. We always think of somebody else that we can, put out there so we can get away. Verse 12, God says, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you've brought the people up out of Egypt, you'll worship God on this mountain. Two things. First of all, in his answer to, I'm not able, I'm not equipped, I'm not worthy, what God says to him is the same thing he says to you and I when we bring up those excuses. You know what he says? Yes, you're right. You're right. I knew that before I spoke to you. That you're not worthy, you're not equipped, you're not able to do this. It's not about you. Never was. It's about me. I will be with you. That's all you need. That's the only qualification you need. And I didn't go to your brother Aaron. I have a role for him too, but I didn't go to him. I came to you. You're the guy. This whole burning bush, this is your burning bush. This name that I called, I didn't call out Moses, Aaron, whoever's there. No, I called you. I said it twice so there wouldn't be a mistake. And I'm sending you, and I'm saying to you, I will be with you. And here's the second part. He says, and I'm going to give you a sign. Wouldn't it be great if every time God asked us to do something really difficult, he first gave us a sign? Now, sometimes he'll do that, but very rarely. If you look in the Bible, you don't see it very often. Gideon managed to get one. I don't know how. Most of the time, here's what happens. God says, I'm going to give you a sign. And you know what the sign that he promises Moses is? He says that when you take my people out of Egypt, you'll come back and you'll worship me on this mountain, and that'll be your sign. What? So after I go do this really hard thing that you're telling me to do that I really don't think I can do, after I do it, I'll know I can do it? Thanks. But what God is saying to him is, no, listen, what I'm saying to you is, I'm giving you a guarantee. You're coming back here because I'm going to go with you and I'm going to bring you back. And he did. So what God is saying, we always say to God, listen, show me a miraculous sign and I'll think about doing what you tell me to do. And God always says, no, do what I tell you to do and I'll show you a miraculous sign. I'll do something amazing if you trust me. Funny how none of our excuses has changed over time. Verse 13, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? Second objection we always use. I'm afraid. I'm inadequate and I'm afraid. You want me to go try to lead somebody. What if they tell me I don't want to follow? I'm sure Moses was already thinking about what had happened before. The one time in his life he exhibited leadership when he tried to tell these two Hebrews to quit fighting. And one of them said, who are you to tell me what to do, you murderer? I'm sure Moses is thinking, I think there's a really good chance that people aren't going to follow me. He's afraid. He's afraid of how people are going to respond. Verse 14, God says to Moses, I am who I am. If people ask you what my name is, you're to say to them, I am has sent me to you. I am. It's interesting that the Lord, when he's identifying himself, because the name of God has been used in the scripture before. It's called a tetragram. It's a very fancy theological word for 4 consonants. The Jews were so revering of God that whenever they would write his name, they would only put 4 consonants. Actually, 2 were repeated. And it worked out to the equivalent in our alphabet to Y-H-W-H. And how do you pronounce something where there's no vowels? It's just, that's kind of it. And nobody, because it wasn't a real word, nobody knew, even the Hebrews didn't know what it meant. They wouldn't even write it. And so now Moses is saying, I need to tell your name. I need to identify who you are if anybody asks me. I need to give credentials. So what'll I say? And God doesn't say, well, just tell him, sent you. He doesn't do that. Instead, he speaks to him in his own language, Hebrew, and he says to him, you tell him, Asher sent you. In Hebrew, that means I am, which I am, or who I am, or that I am. In Hebrew is a kind of a verb, and it means to exist, to be. And so what he's telling him is basically, the one who exists, that's me, and that's who's sending you. God is explaining, I believe, his name, Yahweh, which we didn't know what meant, we still don't. He's explaining that part of what it means is I'm self-existent. I'm not like anything or anyone you know. I have no beginning. I have no end. I'm timeless. I'm infinite. I'm eternal. I'm God. Nice to meet ya. I created all that is. All that exists was created by me, and I have no creator. Time does not affect me because I created time. Space does not affect me because I created space. These are all constructs that I made for you to keep your brain from exploding when you try to think about things that you don't understand. But for me, you don't understand me. But I'm telling you, I, the self-existent one, will be with you. I'll go with you. So quit worrying about what people say. You want to know the greatest irony of all? After all, and we get great theology from this verse, but you want to know something really funny? And it never occurred to me until I read it this week. Nobody ever asked Moses who sent him. If you know the story, Moses goes into Goshen, he talks to the people, he deals with Pharaoh, they go through all that, they eventually leave Egypt after looting them, they cross the Red Sea miraculously, they go into the wilderness throughout Moses' entire life. And he got questioned a lot. Nobody ever asks him somewhere in the desert, hey, by the way, Moses, who sent you? The only reason we even know about the dialogue is because Moses remembered it and wrote it down and figured it was important that God revealing himself might be something we want to remember. But nobody ever asked him. All right. Let's take a look at leadership and what leadership means to God. Because you're still probably thinking, well, this is all great, but I'm not a leader. Yes, you are. You're just not the type that you think. First of all, leadership, how did Moses lead? Did he go in and say, I'm the mighty Moses, spoken to by the I am. You shall all follow me. I have a 3-point plan here for how we'll make our escape from Egypt. Moses was just a schlep. He was just an average guy. What did he do? He followed God. He followed God. He did what God said. And by following God, he was going the way that nobody else goes. And the people followed him. The people followed him. That's leadership. It's just setting an example to follow God, to do what he says. If you do what God says, you will automatically become a leader. I don't care what you do. You may not ever have any formal authority, but that doesn't matter. Leadership isn't about formal authority. It isn't having a title in front of your name or after your name. It's about just following God where he tells you to go. And if you do that, you're a leader. How do we do that? First of all, separation. Notice that God tells Moses, first thing you need to be aware of is you're on holy ground. If you're talking to me, you're on holy ground. We need to come out of the world. God will never, ever use you if you're compromised by sin. 2 Corinthians 7:1, therefore, since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. Hebrews 12:14, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. My question is, are you different from the world? Can anybody tell that what you say about your faith is being played out in your real life? Because if you aren't, then you're lost. God didn't call you to have nothing happen. He called you to be different. The next thing is sending. Sending. God separates us and then he sends us. What does he send us to do? He sends us to go and follow his voice. And that might take you down a million different pathways, but wherever you go, you'll be sent by God. Which means, since you've been sent by God, you got to get rid of self-doubt or self-reliance. It isn't about you, it's about him. And you also have to get rid of fear of others. You need to fear him. I wish I had time to expand on that. He says, go, I'm sending you. And when you get there, tell them the I am has sent me. Wherever you go, you've been sent by God. 2 Peter 1:3, his divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Jesus, in speaking to his disciples, said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. When Jesus sent his disciples out to do what he said, he promised them he would go with them, and he told them that they had authority to do it. So do you. So do you. Are you following where God leads? That's the only question. It's not about whether or not you're a natural leader. It's really more about whether you're a follower. And then lastly, selflessness. When Moses said, who am I? I've been crucified with Christ, Paul said, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Philippians 2:3 and 4. Real leaders are not about themselves. That's my question to you. Is it more about you, or is it more about him? Is it more about others? To be a leader, you have to learn to be selfless, and that's hard to do. We like being about ourselves. But you'll never be used by God, and you'll never experience what he's trying to get you to do if you're not willing. Final story. This is from one of my favorite speakers, Stuart Briscoe. He's an Englishman who served as a pastor just outside of Milwaukee in Wisconsin for years and told a lot of stories. And one of my favorites is this. He says, one of the men who had a profound effect on my life as a young person was Captain H.S. May, a career soldier in the Royal Artillery in Britain, and an extremely godly Christian. He spent much time in the Briscoe home when I was a lad and encouraged me in many ways over the years, especially spiritually. Years later, when I was 17, I was drafted to serve during the Korean conflict, and I decided to join the Royal Marines. After learning of my decision, Captain May gave me some important advice. He said, young man, you must be sure to nail your colors to the mast right away. I'd never heard that expression before. So he explained to me that back in the old days, when a ship of the Royal Navy would sail into battle, the colors of the monarch would be hoisted up onto the mast to identify the ship to every other ship at sea. The ship identified who it belonged to, which king it served, based on the flag that flew. And that flag would stay up there until such time as that ship was either taken out of service and retired or defeated in battle. If it was defeated in battle, the custom was that the colors of the monarch would be slowly lowered, usually as a sad song was played. And then either the white flag of surrender would go up, and then usually after that would come the flag of the conquering monarch would be raised on the mast. But there were certain captains at sea who decided that that was not acceptable. And so they would send their crewmen at the very beginning of a new voyage. They would send their crewmen up the mast to get to the flag of their monarch, and he would have them nail it to the mast so it couldn't be dropped down. And the clear message was, better to go down fighting for our king than to surrender. So Briscoe, hearing that noble story, thought, well, that's wonderful. Okay, so how do I nail my colors to the mast if I'm going into the Royal Marines? And Captain May says, well, that's easy. I'll tell you how I did it. So the first night that I was in boot camp, all the other soldiers were in the room with me. I got down next to my bed on one knee, and I began to pray to my God. And Briscoe, young guy, says, well, then what happened? And Captain May said, well, they all picked up their boots and they threw them at me as hard as they could. Whacked me on the head, on the body. I got pelted all over the place. And Briscoe's like, that's a horrible story. What do you mean? They threw their boots at you? Yes, of course. Well, what did you do? And Captain May said, well, I took them, and throughout that night, I polished them and returned them to each soldier, of course. And Briscoe thought, man, oh man, I don't know if I'm up to this. I don't know if I can do this. That's kind of scary thinking about having to go and, nail my color to the mast, and I'm going to get pelted by boots at boot camp. It really is going to be boot camp. He said when he got to boot camp, he was more afraid of doing that than any other thing that he was going to face. And when the first night came, when they were set up in their barracks, he said, I got down next to my bunk and I began to pray. But I have to admit, I did it very quietly, and I put my hand over my head like I was scratching something, and I was hoping that really nobody would notice me so I could be able to tell Captain May, yes, of course, I nailed my color to the mast, spiritually speaking, but in fact, I kind of fudged and got away with something. He said, but of course, after I finished praying, I kind of slowly looked up. He says, and every other Marine in that room was encircled around my bed with a curious look staring at me. And their first question was, what are you doing? He said, I didn't want to tell them that I was nailing my color to the mast because I figured they wouldn't understand that. So I told them finally, well, sheepishly, I was praying. He goes, I have to admit, I was expecting a hail of boots right at that point, but I didn't get that. Instead, some of them turned around and just went back to their bunk. But a few of them sat around and began to ask me why I was praying, what I was praying for, and who I was praying to. And he goes, and I wound up having a conversation with 3 other Marines that were in there with me, and he goes, I wound up leading like one of them to Christ. And when I got back and Captain May asked me, did you nail your colors to the mast? I told him, yes, I did. It worked. Beloved, God is calling all of us in our own way and in our own place to be leaders. But you can't do it if you don't first nail your color to the mast and identify yourself as the son of God, a daughter of the King. My prayer today is that maybe this gives you some food for thought. There's 5 other things that God's calling you to specifically, and I'll expand on some of those things as we go along here. But my prayer, this first one, that it would give you some pause for thought. Moses wasn't a fancy guy. He was just an ordinary guy, and he didn't think he was a leader. And yet God used him to do some amazing things. He'll use you too if you let him. Father, thank you for your word. It is truth. I pray that you would just speak to each heart here as only you can. Draw us close, Lord. Teach us how to lead by following. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. We'll see you next time.